about one of the chapters of my thesis, which is really exploring the state of planning within municipalities across British Columbia. It's really an attempt to understand how these various climate action plans have integrated considerations of health and health systems into their planning process. And so just a quick background on what climate action plans are. They are in many ways a tool designed to guide regions in their mitigation and adaptation action as it concerns climate change, and they tend to set like emissions reduction targets. They integrate climate action into broader policy frameworks within the municipality. And in BC, this has come as a result of, yes, okay, slide moved. So in BC in 2007, there was a climate action charter, which a number of municipalities voluntarily signed up to. And that process kind of led into Bill 27, which is a local government statutes amendment act that kind of mandated all municipalities within BC to have climate action and climate considerations integrated into their official community plans. And in 2009, there began to be a lot of those integration of climate action into community plans. Some communities have them embedded within their community plans. Other communities developed specific climate action plans. So this review, this document review is actually focused on those communities that developed specific climate action plans, because official community plans tend to contain way more information about the community broadly that doesn't really concern climate action. So this is really focused on those climate action plans. And so the goal of this work, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is to understand how these governance systems, municipalities specifically, address the health dimensions of climate action and climate adaptation planning, and then identify how health systems are integrated into this work of building adaptive capacity and adapting to climate change. And then the methods. So the focus of this work is actually the document review of over around 40 climate action plans. The plans I reviewed were mostly developed in 2020 onward, so about 90% of them were developed in 2020 onward. This does not mean that there were not earlier plans that were then revised, in 2020 or after. So some of these municipalities actually had earlier plans that were revised. I just focused on the newest available plans from the municipalities. And then, as you're going to see in the map soon, most of these plans were for municipalities in the interior and lower mainland. Another aspect of this work is I conducted interviews with community leaders mostly, so mayors, councillors, people involved in municipal government or involved in nonprofits that serve and support municipal government, to kind of learn from them too what their thinking was and their process was with climate action planning, and attempting to probe for any health considerations, which we would see how well that went. Okay, clicker. So this is just an overview of the areas that were covered in each of these dimensions. So the document review, you can kind of see that clustering in the lower mainland, Fraser Valley, interior. And in the interviews, in many ways, I was explicitly focused on connecting with people in northern, more rural and remote regions to kind of learn that diversity of perspective, because I think very much that rural areas are quite different from urban areas in the way they think about climate action. So that reflects like an explicit attempt to get to those people. I tried to speak to people in other places too, but that did not go as well. So, okay, so an introduction to the results. And the main thing here was that the framing of health seemed, in my opinion, very risk focused. So there was this often description of the fact that climate change poses risks to health. Communities would describe those risks as they see the importance in their community. So communities that are facing issues with heat, we'll talk about things like heat stress and factors like that. But in the adaptation or mitigation action portion of the document, the health frame would kind of disappear. So it would be discussed as an introduction, like these are the challenges we face, health included. And then when they begin to speak about the actions they were taking, health will kind of disappear in the plans. And it seemed to me that there was this, in some plans, almost like a trickle down notion of health, where it would be like, they would maybe allude to the fact that, oh, green space is also good for health. And there will be that notion there, but no like explicit description of how health is integrated into the planning for green space. So it will be mentioned in passing almost as a possible outcome of an action, but not integrated into how an action is planned. And health system was also occasionally described as a collaborator with no definition of what their role will be in collaboration. So it was sometimes to me felt like an add-on, like we're adding the people that are involved would also tackling the health authority. So that was kind of the way it felt to me. And in general, the focus of climate action was very environment, ecosystem, land use planning focused, which makes perfect sense, right? But it also reflects a very environment frame of climate change, which also makes a lot of sense. But in my opinion, it's just lacking that integration of the environment and health. It seems to do this thing where we segment the environment we live from the ways our bodies function, which I think we should bring those two together better. But infrastructure and land use planning was a big part. It was reflected in practically every single adaptation plan I reviewed. There was some discussion of communal pooling type activities, shared green space, community gardens, community-based emergency response planning. And I found that specifically interesting because emergency response planning is something that you think of as pretty connected to health if you're responding to an emergency, because there's oftentimes health implications. But even in that, health was not often well described or integrated into that conception of emergency response planning. And then there was also the diversifying water and energy sources. That's another place that I would think of health is water and the water that we consume, but also health was often absent in that conception of water use. And then knowledge sharing and resource sharing, which is the place that in some cases health will begin to come in, where they would say, oh, we'll need information on health risk from the health authority. So that was the dimension where there was some allusion to health, but in my opinion, relatively limited. Promise, I want you to go forward. Okay, so here's some quotes from the mayors I spoke to. So we can kind of see that same framing also reflected in the way the mayors talked about their plans for adaptation. So it was thinking about community forest and ecosystem restoration. That was the way they were thinking about planning, was very ecosystem focused and like forest and forest management. And then agriculture, right? So in thinking about what producers are considering and agricultural producers and exploring how the valley can have water resources in response to agricultural needs more so than any health type considerations. And another dimension of this was the fact that the action plans often mentioned need for external input. So external technical support in infrastructure planning, or informational support like climate projections and climate data, things like that. And then they would mention financial support. But this is another area where I felt health should come in, because if you wanted informational support, I would think you would think of the health system as a possible partner in supporting you access high quality information on what your community's needs are, but that was less so. But financial support was a big part. There was a lot of conversation about grants and funding, which the action plans were a lot more optimistic about the process of getting funding than the mayors who I spoke to, who were very not optimistic. So there was this very clear notion of the capacity constraints that come with accessing funding. And this was also representative of these rural, more remote communities that have smaller municipal government and smaller capacity in many ways. And they would make the point that in some ways it was this counselor actually crystallized that point for me. It's like the vulnerabilities were stacking up on each other. So they already have a community that is relatively poor and has limited, their tax base is very limited because they are relatively poor. And to access grants to support their climate action, they need a stronger municipal power in some ways to an extent, and also just staff capacity. Like they just need people to write, to be able to write grants. But that's something the municipality doesn't have because it's a poorer municipality. And also the idea of 50-50 splits. So oftentimes, even when they want to implement specific actions, there will be like, the community will have to bring 50% and the government will match that contribution. But for a poorer community, you see how that will be like a significant challenge. So this kind of pointed to me also that fact that what we would within the health system consider as health vulnerabilities like economic power is also the vulnerability of an institution like a municipality. So they also have the vulnerability of limited economic power, and that constrains their ability to act in any way that is protective for health and wellness. And so, in conclusion, I made it. In conclusion, I would say my observation there was that there is such rich evidence now about the scope of climate risk to health, especially within Canada. We have epidemiological studies of effects of forest fire and PM 2.5 exposure and heat and floods. And it's a growing body of evidence that is, in my opinion, relatively, I guess, not so well known based on my review of the climate action plans, but it's out there. But this seems to be so segmented to the position of risk that it's not filtering into the thinking about planning and the integration of multiple frames of reference in the planning process. And I think for me, why that's such a big issue is that the way we frame a problem kind of impacts who we engage with in attempting to solve the problem. The way we frame a problem impacts how we think of solutions to a problem. So if we frame this climate action issue as purely environmental and disconnect it from the embodied experiences of people, we oftentimes fail to really connect those actions in a way that can support people's health and wellness. And I also tend to think that the health frame is quite valuable in getting people on board into climate action initiatives. There's research evidence to show this, that there's an added value to when people know that this active transportation solution is not just a GHG emissions reduction solution. It is tied to health and wellness and improving the health of community. And I feel like those links are, for me, so obvious that it kind of feels staggering to see them so absent in this like multiple municipal action plan. So I just think we can do a lot better in that area. And that's it. Yay. So questions. I think somebody has Zoom. Go for it. Right. So I have a few examples that pop in my head, and one of them, oh, good. I already forgot to repeat the question. Okay, so Jess is asking whether there were some specific action plans that popped up in my review as being exemplary in the way they describe health and wellness. I have a few. One of them that really sticks out for me is the city of Vernon, which is in the interior region of BC. And they had explicit connections between every plan, every like action area. They would write health co-benefits, like describe how this provides health co-benefits. And that was such, like, it was explicitly stated in that way. And I really appreciated that. There were a few other communities that you would find it like somewhere embedded deep in the document where it is. But for them, it was like the graphics of the document, the way it was laid out, with every action, they would highlight if there are health co-benefits. I think they could have thought more in more detail about how those health benefits fit in multiple other areas. But the fact that it was described there explicitly as co-benefit using that term was actually quite unique. So I would say Vernon sticks in my mind for that. Yeah. Okay. So you take this. Mhm. Yes. No. So the question was, do I want to look at community plans? So the answer to that is no, because community plans already would include an explicit community health and safety component. The part of a community plan is to really describe like the broader trajectory of the community, its demography, its changes, the way they see the future. So there's already explicitly like this health consideration as part of a community plan that is almost like required by virtue of the municipality's role in the life of its community. Meanwhile, a climate action plan does not have to include a health consideration. I think it should have to, but it doesn't. There's not a requirement for climate action plans to bring in health considerations or anything like that. So in some ways, they offer like a very clear, for me, in my opinion, notion of how communities think of those things as together or not together. Because a community that thinks of it as connected would have health where it's not required or mandated to have like a health component. Meanwhile, a community plan kind of requires pretty thoughtful consideration of the health of the community. Does that make sense? Nods. Okay. Okay. Ray's question is, what is keeping health out of these plans? The most true answer is I do not know, but I can I can say a few things about that. So I think to an extent there is, I wouldn't say lack of imagination. I would say maybe a lack of capacity. So I think that imagination requires capacity in many ways, that sometimes I feel like these plans are so like rote. It's like maybe it was a consulting firm that developed the plan and maybe they consulted with people in the community, but it's in some ways like formulaic in a way that it doesn't really invite as much imagination, possibly. So I'll say there's that capacity constraint where it's like it has this very formulaic way of being written that sometimes you wonder if there was actually broad, active, thoughtful engagement in the process of developing the plan itself. So I feel like that's one end. And another end is, I would say, the health system itself, to complain about the health system. The health system itself often is not as engaged with municipalities. There tends to be sometimes a disconnect between the health system and municipalities. The health system itself is just figuring out how to think about climate action within itself and then do the work of doing outreach to municipalities. So I feel like the more that outreach happens from the health system, the more municipalities know that they should be thinking about this. Because in some ways, it makes sense that if you're a municipality that cares, your primary focus is solid waste, community forests, things like that. Those are so front of mind that until somebody else brings in that notion, it may be absent. That's one dimension. But my wish is that it's not absent, that everybody just immediately goes there in their mind, where you think the forest, the people as connected, but yeah. And also funding streams don't work like that. That's another part of this. Is like people get funded to act from particular funding stream. They get the funding from the Ministry of Forest. So they're not thinking about the health dimension, right? Because their funding also kind of shapes the way they imagine what is a possible solution. So yeah, multiple purposes. Yeah, Amanda. Oh, you had a question? Yes. Sure. Yes. So great news. Health authorities, almost all of them now. So we have 6 health authorities. PHSA is kind of a health authority. So 5 regional health authorities within BC. 4 of them have completed climate action plans, roadmaps, things like that, that are actually operationally guiding the health authorities in their action, which is exciting. Northern Health is the one that still does not yet have a climate action plan. It's in development, I hear. So there is a lot of work being done by the health authorities to actually do that outreach now. It's ongoing. So health authorities have now employed people that are climate action leads who do the work of actually going into community, engaging with not-for-profit organizations, municipalities, in kind of awareness raising campaigns is a big part of what health authorities are doing now. So yes, that outreach is actually happening. There's good news on that end. Okay. is correct. That's a great plan. I the BC, so there is like I think there's maybe a BC First Nations climate action thing. I'm not sure yet, but this is BC focused. So I've seen like a national Inuit climate action plan. I've seen a Yukon one, but there's less like regional BC ones. So that's really why they were included. Because this was really, I literally looked at the list of every municipality in BC and searched for a climate action plan in each of their websites. So that was really the method. So that's the reason why it was not an explicit exclusion. It was just because there's no regional ones right now. Yes.
Okay, we have another question. I appreciate your explanation. What are some possibilities?
Right. My answer to that is sadly a very like basic one, but I think it's collaboration. I really think it's about having people at the table for planning. Is the fact that like in the process of planning, who is present to give voice to what the possibilities are. And I think when planning happens just among planners and engineers coming after me, so it's fine with this. When planning is very like engineering, physical environment focused, sometimes it misses that health component that will really just be present if you had someone who worked in health at the table. So I feel like the first step is really just collaboration, nothing much more than that.